Hey everybody, I hope everybody's had a happy Easter. And since it's Easter, I thought this would be the perfect time for us to talk about the next part of our series in hope, which is the hope that we have in the empty tomb. Now, while Christ's death on the cross provided us for the atonement of the sin that gave us the payment for the penalty that we have deserved rightfully, it's not the cross, but in the empty tomb where we find our hope. And that's what I want to focus on in this series today. Luke chapter 24, verses 4 through 7 says, "As they stood there puzzled, two men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. The women were terrified and bowed with their faces to the ground. Then the men asked them, 'Why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again on the third day.'" When man entered into this world, he brought into it sin. When Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, it passed through all of humanity. Sin reigned. Death reaped across the land, and there was nothing but pain and suffering. It has been our plight since the beginning. And that's been the world that all of human history had been living through, in this world of decay and fallenness and death. But that wasn't the world that God intended, and that was not the world that God planned to leave us with. From the very foundations of the world, God planned, before man even set foot on this planet, to come and redeem us. He knew that we required mercy, that we required a payment that we could not fulfill for our sin. He knew that he wanted to provide us with his mercy, but he couldn't provide us with mercy unless he also provided perfect justice by the punishment of sin that it rightfully deserves. And so when he came to the cross, when Jesus bore that pain and that death on the cross, he brought through his broken body the payment for sin, and it allowed the opening for the mercy of God to reap upon us. But even at that moment, even though he had told his disciples multiple times, they didn't understand what was going on. Even as he told them that he was going to die, even as he died, they didn't understand it. And even when he came back and told people that he was alive, they still didn't believe it, because it wasn't until that moment, until the resurrection, that we saw the ultimate truth. The resurrection of Christ in the cross, from his death on the cross, brought us in the proof, the ultimate proof that God keeps his promises, that the promises that he had made in the past were true, and they were to be fulfilled. When he died on the cross, it made that payment. But the cross is not what brought the hope back to man, because when his followers saw him dead on the cross, it didn't leave them with hope. It left them in misery, because they didn't understand. They didn't really realize what was happening. But when he came out of that tomb, when he resurrected from the dead, when he defeated death and he defeated sin, that's what ushered in hope, because that fulfilled the promises that he had always made to us from the very beginning. And what are those promises? Well, let's look in Isaiah and find out. Isaiah 61 verse 1 says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed." This is the promise that God has made us. We see here in Isaiah the promise that was fulfilled at the cross. And it's through the resurrection that we get the fulfillment of that promise, that we finally have the feeling of the hope that God has provided for us. So what does this promise actually tell us? Well, it says three things. Number one, he promises to bind and mend the brokenhearted. What this means is that Jesus' death is going to bring to man the binding of the wounds of sin, the destruction and the decay that sin has caused to man and to this world. Through Christ, he has come to mend those damages. Number two, it talks about how the captives are going to be set free. See, sin makes us enslaved. When we live through this world without the sacrifice of Christ, we're in bondage to sin. And the bondage of sin keeps us trapped by it, and it leads us to death, and we can't escape it. But through Christ's crucified body, we are granted the freedom that that comes with. And we are broken free from the enslavement of sin. And so Jesus' death brings that freedom. And number 3, the prisoners are to be set free. Now, why does he use that word prisoners? Well, what is a prisoner? Someone who has committed a penalty. Someone who's done something wrong, and they have been rightfully put in prison. You see, because of the sin that we've committed, we are guilty before the throne room of God. We are guilty of the sin that we have committed. But because of what Jesus has done, his death has brought the proclamation, the hope that we will now be set free because our penalty has been paid. And we are rightfully freed from that to enter into the eternal kingdom, that by accepting Christ's death on the cross, by what he did, he has proclaimed that we have been granted freedom from that penalty. And this is the amazing good news that we have. In John chapter 14, it tells us that we are given another great promise. It says, because I live, you will also live. And this is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of Scripture. And this was told to the disciples before Jesus even died. It was a guarantee that they wouldn't really understand until the day when Christ came back. They didn't really understand the hope that he was providing for them until they saw the empty tomb. That because he would live, they would. If he didn't live, if he died on the cross and that was it, there was no atonement. He wasn't God. He was just some man. But because he came back, because death couldn't hold him, because he was so perfect that he couldn't be kept in the grave, that brought the guarantee that he was going to bind the brokenhearted, he was going to set the captives free, he was going to release the prisoners that were in bondage, and that because he lives, we also live. And that is the message of the gospel that we see from the empty tomb. Now, I want us to see one other quick, very amazing thing about this message that we've been given, and that's the word gospel. We call this the gospel message. It's called the Gospels when we talk about the first 4 books of the New Testament. But why do we use that word, and what is so significant about the word gospel? And so I want to look at that real quickly. In the ancient Greek, the word gospel actually comes from the word evangelion, which means good news. And this is actually a derivative. It comes from the verb evangelos. Sometimes that word is also translated angelos, which is where we get the word angel or messenger. But evangelos is the Greek word for a messenger, specifically what we would think of as a herald. Okay, so what's significant about that word, evangelos? Obviously, that sounds like the word to evangelize, but why is that so important? Well, this word, this idea of a herald, it comes from this concept of a victory in a battle. So in 490 BC, you had the Battle of Marathon, one of the most famous ancient battles in all the world. It was where the Greeks were fighting against the Persians. And in this amazing battle, against all odds, they defeated the Persian invasion. And after that defeat, they wanted to go back and tell the Athenians that they had won. So they sent a messenger, a herald, and his job was to return the message about their victory. And according to legend, he ran the entire 26-mile journey to get back to Athens, and he died at the doorsteps of Athens proclaiming victory. This is not an uncommon idea that would occur. Whenever a battle would occur, they would immediately send back messengers because they didn't have communications like we have now. And of course, cities would be sitting on the edge to find out whether or not their sons and whether or not their brothers and husbands lived, whether or not they won. And these heralds would come and they would proclaim victory or proclaim defeat to their city. And of course, they would bring this message of extreme joy whenever it was a victorious message. And that is the image, that's the kind of depiction that we're getting through that word evangelos or through the word gospel. This is a proclamation of victory that Christ has had on the cross. And this is why that word is so important, because we, Christians, are that herald. It is our job to evangelos, to herald, to proclaim the victory of Christ on the cross, to proclaim, hey, there is an empty tomb, to bring and spread that hope to the world. And so that's what God leaves us with. That's the hope that he leaves us with, that he wants us to then take into the world and proclaim. So on this Easter, I want to leave you with that message of hope, and I want to leave you with that challenge that we go out and we evangelize, that we go out and we spread the gospel, the good news of the Christ that died for us and of the tomb that was left empty because the body that was no longer there because of the grave that couldn't keep it, and because of the defeat of death and Satan, sin and evil.